Just a Little Dare by Hooliganships. Chapter 2. What's This Feeling? The next morning began like any other. Brooke was standing on the deck, playing soft tunes fitting for the early morning hours. When Sanji got up to prepare breakfast, Zoro woke up as well. It was instinct at this point. It had nothing to do with vigilance or not feeling safe. There was no place where he felt safer than on the Thousand Sunny. It was more like he was always hyper-aware of where the cook was at any time, be it on board of the ship or in a fight. On a normal day, Zoro would wake up, register that Sanji was leaving, and fall back asleep. But today wasn't a normal day. He laid in his bed, eyes closed, but every other sense focused on the cook who walked quietly around the room. Every breath, every shift, was catalogued and used to create a picture in Zoro's head. Only when Sanji had left the room did Zoro allow himself a deep sigh. There was no way he was going back to sleep now. Behind his eyes he could still see the scene from the evening before. Sanji, face flushed, sitting next to him and waving the empty bottle in Zoro's face. He had been so angry at that moment, and his first reaction had been to get him back for it. But why did his brain come up with the idea to kiss him? He rubbed both hands over his face and let out a silent scream as he felt how hot it was. That hadn't been his first kiss, not with how long he had already been travelling on the ocean, but he wouldn't say he was experienced either. How was he supposed to get out of this mess? How was he supposed to woo the cook if he was being completely undone by simply holding his hand on the way back to the ship? But he was also not going to give up. He just needed to fluster the cook even more than he did with Zoro, and with time he would get used to this. Yes, that was a solid plan. Simple, straightforward, exactly as he liked it. And maybe it would be easier to do these kinds of things when no one else was around to watch. He had always been a more private person when it came to his feelings, and he didn't like to broadcast them to a large audience. With his mind made up, he heaved himself out of his bunk and went through his morning routine. He entered the kitchen to see Sanji already elbows deep in preparation. Still figuring out his plan of attack, he approached slowly. "Morning," he said, in his friendliest tone possible. Sanji's head snapped up, and his eyes locked with Zoro's. There was a light blush staining his cheeks, and Zoro took a twisted kind of pleasure in the fact that he wasn't the only one who was uncomfortable. "Morning," Sanji answered, his voice sounding a bit more composed than he looked. "You're up early?" Zoro shrugged. "Couldn't sleep any more." "That's unusual for you." A small, almost teasing smile played over Sanji's lips, and Zoro was trying hard to reel back his first instinct, which was to snap at Sanji. Instead, he shrugged again. "Need any help?" he offered, and smiled when he noticed how taken aback Sanji looked. Sure," Sanji trailed off, unsure, and looked around the kitchen. "Can you cut those vegetables?" Zoro nodded. He might not have been as precise or as fast as Sanji with a kitchen knife, but knife work was still knife work. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, and worked in silence. Zoro was surprised by how tranquil it felt. When the two of them weren't busy bickering with each other, they worked surprisingly well together. They moved around each other in a dance that seemed almost practiced. Zoro could see in Sanji's face that the blonde cook was as bewildered by this as Zoro, but neither voiced their feelings or complained. It was surprisingly nice. Over the next hour, the rest of their crew made their way through the kitchen. Everyone except Robin and Luffy had to do a double take at seeing the two of them work together, but they wisely chose not to comment. When there was nothing more to do for Zoro, he decided to go out onto the deck and get some more training in before breakfast was served. Sanji briefly looked up from the frying pan he was working on, and gave him a quick smile before looking down again. "Thank you for your help, I appreciate it." And that was when Zoro saw an opportunity. He stepped in close and leaned in. In a quick move, he pressed a dry, gentle kiss against Sanji's cheek. "You're welcome." He turned around and left the kitchen without looking back. As soon as he was outside, he had to hunch down and tuck his head between his knees and simply breathe. He could feel the heat radiating off of his face, and a sound reminiscent of a whine threatened to make its way out of his throat. How did other people do this so easily? "Zoro, are you okay?" Usopp had stepped up next to him and hovered an unsure hand over his shoulder. "Fine." He pressed out from between his gritted teeth, refusing to look up. "I'm fine." "Ah, young love," Brooke sighed from his position on the grass. "Shut up." Sanji was standing still, frozen to the spot where he had been when Zoro had kissed him. His brain was just repeating what just happened to him in a loop. Only the smell of burning was able to rip him out of his thoughts, and with a curse he lifted the frying pan off the stove. The pancake inside was slightly burnt. Nothing you couldn't eat, but not something that Sanji in his position as a chef could serve. So this was going to be his own breakfast, he supposed. With a sigh, he placed the singed pancake to the side and moved on to the next one. That damned mosshead had to throw him completely off his game. Why was he suddenly so helpful? Did he think that would be enough to woo Sanji? Ha! As if. He would need to do a lot better than this. Fueled with self-righteousness, anger, and the need to not be outdone by the swordsman, he set to work. He whipped up the rest of the planned breakfast foods. While he was putting on the finishing touches of the last plate, the rest of the crew walked in. "Sanji!" Luffy yelled while jumping onto his seat. "Food!" Yeah, you annoying rubber ball, calm down. Together with Usopp's and surprisingly again Zoro's help, they carried the plates to the table. Sanji tried his best to calm down his racing heart. He had a plan and he was going to stick to it. When everything except the pancakes was on the table, Sanji grabbed the two special plates for Nami and Robin and served them first. "Nami-san, Robin-chan, please enjoy your meal." But he didn't linger around them as he usually did. He went back to the kitchen counter and grabbed the last plate that he had prepared. Something in him recoiled at the thought of giving this kind of special attention to the mosshead, but it was all just a means to an end. He would make Zoro eat his words from the evening before and win this bet and prove once and for all what a good catch he truly was. With a flourish and his most charming smile, he placed the plate in front of Zoro, leaning slightly in his personal space and brushing up against his shoulder as he did so. "And this is for you, honey. Thank you again for your help this morning." He grabbed one of the swordsman's hands off the table and pressed a kiss against his scarred knuckles. "I made it with love. I hope you enjoy it." The plate was stunning, as usual. The pancakes were perfect, golden brown, and fluffy and in the shape of a heart. Out of different kinds of fruits, Sanji had carved flowers and other garnishes, and the chocolate sauce on top was writing out Zoro's name. He took his seat next to Zoro and started to eat, ignoring the looks of everyone around him. He could practically feel the heat radiating off of Zoro's face and patted himself on the back for a job well done. He didn't even blush this time. Turns out it was a lot easier to dole out affection than receiving it. "Unfair!" Luffy yelled and pointed accusingly at Zoro. "Zoro's not a woman. Why does he get special treatment? I want special pancakes too." "Zoro is an exception to the rule," Sanji replied calmly, before putting another bite of food in his mouth. Even though the pancake was a bit charred, it was still delicious, and he would rather eat it than waste it and throw it away. "But I'm the captain," Luffy continued to whine, a big pout on his face. "Well, but Zoro is my boyfriend." Next to him, Zoro cursed as he almost dropped his glass. Sanji reached over and refilled it without looking away from Luffy. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the matching wide grins on Robin and Nami's faces. Usopp looked torn between amusement and horror, and Frankie was holding himself back from his usual yell. For a second, Luffy looked at him, brows furrowed in thought. "So if I was your boyfriend, I would get special food too?" "No. Why not? Ask your creepy boyfriend to get you food." That seemed to confuse Luffy. "I don't have a boyfriend." "Oh, don't tell that to Law, he's going to be crushed," Usopp snickered out. "Toorao's not my boyfriend." Luffy's chest puffed out in pride, and the smile on his face was blinding. "He's my ally." "So you let all your allies kiss you?" Nami asked with a raised eyebrow. "No!" Luffy protested, arms crossed in front of his chest. "Toorao's my first ally. He's special." The others decided to drop the subject. No one knew what kind of relationship the two captains had with each other, but as long as Luffy was happy and no one tried to kill them in revenge, they didn't care. They finished breakfast in their usual rowdy manner. The only thing missing was the occasional bickering between Zoro and Sanji, one being too embarrassed to say anything, the other being too smug. When the time for cleaning up came, Sanji started to get up from his chair, but was stopped by a hand on his thigh. His eyes immediately snapped towards Zoro, who smiled at him. It was a nice smile, but something told Sanji this was going to be payback for earlier. "Don't worry about the clean-up, darling. You're already cooked. It's only fair if I do the dishes." And with that, he squeezed Sanji's thigh before getting up and gathering the dishes. Sanji sat frozen on his chair, a delicious shiver running up and down his spine. What the fuck? In the end, he and Sanji shared the task of cleaning up after breakfast. They fell into an easy, silent routine again. Zoro tried to use this time to plan his next attack. What exactly did couples do? He was sure he would have an easier time with someone that he actually wanted to spend some time with, but with the cook, the only useful or enjoyable thing he could think of would be sparring. But if he suggested that, he knew what kind of response that would get him. His first instinct was trying an activity away from the ship, but for that, they would need to arrive somewhere first. Nami had said at breakfast they wouldn't reach the next island for another day, maybe even a day and a half, depending on the weather. Now that he thought about it, what did Sanji do the whole day? As far as Zoro knew, the other man was always in the kitchen, either cooking their next meal or preparing snacks for the others. Most importantly, the women on the crew, to enjoy. Sometimes Zoro had seen him reading a book or doing some kind of stretches, but nothing that you could do together. Being in a relationship was more stressful than he had anticipated. What are your plans for the day? Sandy interrupted his thoughts. Zoro looked over to the blond man who was drying his hands on a dish towel. Zoro shrugged. Haven't decided yet. You? I'm going to force Luffy and Usopp to catch some fish. We have some food left, but I'd rather not stretch it too thin. You never know what might happen considering our luck. Zoro nodded in agreement and understanding. He could swear his life had been fairly normal until he had joined this crew. And then I have to start preparations for lunch, Sanji continued while putting away the last plate and closing the cabinet again. Zoro decided at that moment to just go with what he knew and his gut instinct. Up until this point, it had never led him wrong. I'll help you with that again. You don't have to. I want to. He shrugged. It was fun. I wouldn't offer it if I didn't want to do it. Sanji's expression morphed into something surprised, a softer edge to his face. Oh, he said softly. In that case, sure. I'll see you then. Zoro nodded and turned to leave, but thought better of it. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to Sanji's cheek, this one lingering for a few seconds longer than the last. See you later, he said, before leaving the kitchen and taking up his post in the crow's nest. The blush on his face was lesser this time. Instead of that, there was a strange feeling in his stomach. He ignored it and started thinking of some more romantic activities that he could try out with the cook. Sanji felt as if he was living in a parallel universe. His head was spinning because of how nice it had been to spend time with Zoro today. Don't get him wrong, there were still loads of other people Sanji would rather use his time on, but the time they spent in the kitchen had been downright pleasant. If he didn't know this was a competition between him and the Mosshead, he would have been even more confused. But as it stood, both were trying their best to woo the other, and Sanji had an idea that would be romantic and would benefit himself. He finished his preparations and was on his way to search for the swordsman when the man in question walked into the kitchen. Perfect. I was just about to search for you. Zoro nodded as if they had an appointment and he had been expected here. He rolled up his sleeves and looked at Sanji expectantly. What do you need me to do? He gestured to the produce Sanji had already laid out in preparation for dinner. He was confused for a moment before he realized that Zoro thought he wanted him to help in the kitchen again. He lifted his hands and shook his head. Oh, no, I didn't mean for you to help. Don't worry. Zoro frowned. I told you, I'm doing this because I want to, not because I think I have to. As always, Zoro's earnest answer threw Sanji for a loop. How was this the same man that he had butted heads with for years? That's very sweet of you, but I have a surprise for you this time. Instantly, Zoro's body language switched from relaxed to tense, and he gave Sanji a suspicious look. I don't like surprises. I figured, Sanji answered with a smile. But you'll like this one, I promise. Come on. He reached out and boldly took one of Zoro's hands in his. In his head, he reminded himself that he needed to do this to be convincing, and there was absolutely no reason to be this nervous. It was just Zoro. He led him up the stairs into the Sunny's bathroom. He had spoken with the rest of the crew and made sure that no one would be using the bath before dinner. Nami and Robin had agreed they could wait until the day after for their bath. Sanji had promised to make it up to them. Surprisingly enough, they had supplied him with a few things to ensure his success. Their words, not his. The bathroom was dimly lit by a few scented candles given to him by Nami. The water had been enriched with a variety of bath salts, courtesy of Chopper. Robin had gifted him a few roses, whose petals were now scattered around the bathtub and the water. What's this? The look Zoro cast around the room could only be described as horrified. In his head, Sanji was cackling gleefully. Even if this didn't further his goal, it had been worth it just to see the kind of face Zoro was making right now. This is to help you relax. Zoro opened his mouth, no doubt to throw some insults his way, but Sanji was faster. I noticed how you favoured your right arm this morning. I bet it's still a bit sore from our last fight with the Marines. You turned it strangely and sprained it. The swordsman shut his mouth with an audible click and turned away from Sanji with a grumble. I checked with Chopper, Sanji continued. The salts in the water should help your muscle tissue regain its strength faster. Against the recommendations of their doctor, Zoro couldn't say anything. With a defeated sigh, the other man threw his head back. Fine, I'll take the stupid bath. Wonderful, Sanji smiled at him. Wash yourself and then go soak. I'll be back in a little bit. I know how to bathe. Then you should do it more often than once a week, Sanji countered with a mean smile. I have to jump into the ocean practically every day to fetch our idiot captain. They are not the same thing and you know it. Now wash, then soak. With one last glare in Sanji's direction, the grey-haired man followed his instructions with only minimal complaining. Satisfied with his work, Sanji turned around and headed back towards the kitchen. Oi, Zoro called out after him. I'll help with the dishes later. And then he closed the door into Sanji's face. Sanji blamed the strange feeling in his stomach to a particularly rough wave the sunny had to weather. As much as Zoro didn't want to enjoy the bath he was forced into, he had to admit that it was kind of nice. The candles had a pleasant smell that mixed well with the smell of the ocean drifting in through the window. The bathing salts were soothing to his aching muscles and bones, and he felt himself melt even further into the warm water. The only unnecessary part was the flowers. Sure, they looked and smelled kinda nice, but he kinda thought it was a waste. But giving each other dead plants seemed to be a big part of a romantic relationship. The only thing that would have made this better would have been if there was some booze, but since they were out, there was probably no way that he was getting any until the next island. There was a soft knock on the door before it opened, and Sanji stepped in, a covered tray in his hands. Blinking lazily up at him, Zoro raised an eyebrow. What's this? He asked. The last part of your surprise, Sanji announced, before sitting down beside the bathtub. He reached out his hand. Give me your hand, I'm going to trim your nails. I can do that myself. Sanji rolled his eyes and grabbed the towel from the tray. Under it there was a small bottle of sake. You'll need your other hand to hold this. You son of a bitch, Zoro breathed out while making grabby hands in the direction of the bottle. You said we didn't have any more. We don't, Sanji said in a clipped voice. This is not sake for drinking, but cooking. But I know your unrefined palate won't find a difference, and so I decided I could let you have some of it. You're giving me something from your personal stash? He asked with wide eyes. Yes, now give me your hand. Deciding that complaining about this would only hurt himself, he complied and surrendered his hand to Sanji's ministrations. It was rather soothing, if he was honest. The sake burned in his throat, his body was warm and relaxed, and the feeling of being pampered was nice. Not that he would ever admit to that, not even under threat of torture or death. After Sanji was done with his nails, he stood up and gathered his supplies in the now empty sake bottle. Dinner will be done in 15 minutes. Don't be late, please. Before he left, he leaned down and pressed a kiss against Zoro's forehead. He hoped his face was still flushed enough from the warm water that the cook couldn't see just how much that small gesture got him. He just couldn't get over the fact that Sanji, the man he had found annoying at best a few days ago, had become that close to him, and that his body reacted positively to his ministrations. It has to be a purely physical reaction, Zoro thought to himself while he toweled himself dry. There's just no way that it's because of the idiot cook. He dressed in the most comfortable clothes that had mysteriously been laid out for him. And seriously, did the cook go through his stuff? Talk about invasion of privacy. And made his way down into the kitchen. He caught the tail end of Sanji bringing the dishes to the table and grabbed the last 2 plates. I told you don't need to do that, Sanji exclaimed when he saw them. And I told you I do what I want. For a moment it looked like Sanji wanted to keep arguing, but he seemed to decide against it. Zoro shot a satisfied smirk his way, and the cook flipped him off. With a chuckle, Zoro placed the last 2 plates down and took his seat. Not a second later, the door banged open and the rest of their crew entered the kitchen. The whole time that he had spent soaking in the bath, Zoro had thought about how he could upstage Sanji's gesture. The fact that he felt so refreshed right now just made this desire stronger. He wanted to make the cook feel as good as he did right now. For the sake of the bet, of course, nothing else. He kept an eye on him throughout the whole evening, trying to find something that Sanji might need after all this. And even though the idea wasn't entirely new, he did have one. When it was time to clean up, Zoro grabbed Sanji's hands before he could lift a plate. Let me do it, he said in the most serious voice he could offer. Go outside, take your smoke break a bit early. You've been working yourself to the bone lately. Let me do this for you. He could see that the straightforward approach had been the best one. Sanji still wasn't used to the honest compliments, and they always left him flustered. Shitty mosshead, this is my job. His voice lacked the heat it normally would have, and the flush on his cheeks betrayed his quiet pleasure. I know, Zoro said. You're doing a good job, but everyone needs a break. I got one earlier today. It's only fair if you get one too now. The two stared into each other's eyes for a while longer before Sanji was the first to break it. Fine, fine, I'll go. But if you break something in my kitchen, I will throw you overboard, you hear me? Not a single thing better be misplaced. Aye, aye. Zoro gave him a lazy two-fingered salute before he started gathering the dishes. He could still feel Sanji's stare on his back, but he decided to ignore it, instead choosing to focus on his task. When he was sure the other one had left the kitchen, he let out a sigh. Time to put his plan into motion. After he put the dishes away, of course. Sanji was leaning against the railing and watching the smoke drift away lazily in the breeze. The sky and the sea were pitch black, only discernible from each other by a very thin line where the horizon was. But Sanji knew it was only a matter of minutes until that disappeared too, and the only light would be the sunny on the ocean and the stars in the sky. His mind drifted just like the smoke did, and he thought back over the day. It had been a bit over a day, but so much had changed. He wasn't sure if he was comfortable with everything. It was one thing to try and beat Zoro and this stupid game they decided to play, but a whole other situation when he liked the attention. For the whole day, Zoro had been attentive. He had tried to lighten Sanji's workload and be as helpful as he could be. Their bickering had been playful, without the hurtful insults peppered in, and the time they spent together could almost be called fun. At the very least, it had been highly enjoyable. He had always liked to share the kitchen with others. That was one of the main things he missed about his time in the East Blue. Even when he had been challenged by those meatheads in the kitchen, it had always been fun and lively. Now Sanji was on his own in the kitchen. He enjoyed the freedom it gave him and the space he had to work with, but sometimes those manual tasks one had to do to cook went by much faster if there was more than just one person. A cold gust of wind broke over the deck of the Sunny and made Sanji shiver. Nami mentioned the next island they would visit would most likely be a winter island. The sensible thing to do would be go indoors, but right now Sanji enjoyed the dark and the quiet. He wasn't plagued by any melancholic thoughts, but something about just looking out into nothing soothed something within him. His thoughts were interrupted by a blanket being thrown over his shoulders. Confused, he looked up into the eyes of Zoro, who had joined him at the railing. Kitchen is clean again. It's cold out here. You should wear some layers. And what about you? Half your tits are out. If anyone should layer up some more, it's you. Zoro shot him a quick look, and something in Sanji regretted saying those words. He genuinely didn't mind Zoro's company today, and he didn't want to cut it short by a snappy remark. And of course, that way he wouldn't win their bet. That was the main point of this, after all. After a short moment, Zoro grabbed the edge of the blanket and lifted it. With a sidestep, he took the position behind Sanji's back and wrapped the blanket around them both. His hands were placed on Sanji's left and right on the railing, not quite hugging him, but also not keeping his distance at all. Neither man said anything, just staring out ahead quietly. Sanji could smell the bath salts from earlier on Zoro's skin, and his skin was practically radiating warmth. But underneath the fresh smell, there was something distinctly Zoro that Sanji couldn't place. It wasn't a good or bad smell, not particularly strong, just something that Sanji's mind could immediately recognize and put his body at ease. Without a conscious thought from him, his body started to relax and lean more heavily against the railing. His cigarette still held loosely between his lips, the smoke lazily curling up into the sky. The two men kept standing there for quite some time, saying nothing to each other, just watching the stars and enjoying the company, even though both would deny the last part with their dying breath if asked. Thanks for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.